Good afternoon. We'll go ahead and call to order the regular meeting of the City of Murfreesboro Board of Zoning Appeals for December 22nd, 2008. First item on the agenda is consideration of minutes for the regular meeting on November 24, 2008. Those minutes were provided as part of the packet for today. Are there any changes or corrections, additions to those minutes? If not, those minutes will then stand approved as presented. Moving on to now new business, request to amend a previous approval of a variance. This is application Z08092 by Deacon Jeff Owens for East Main Church of Christ, requesting to amend the conditions of approval for a variance that was originally granted by the Board of Zoning Appeals at its July 30, 2008 meeting. The Board approved a 5-foot variance from the minimum required 5-foot side perimeter planting yard width, which was a waiver of the requirement to construct a side perimeter planting yard along the eastern property line in a commercial highway zone. This is for property located at 313 East Vine Street. The approval was made subject to the following condition. The ingress-egress easement along the eastern property line must be relocated to the satisfaction of the City Legal Department, the church, and the adjacent property owner to the east. The proper legal instrument accomplishing this must be recorded at the Rutherford County Register of Deeds office. The applicant is now requesting to have the above condition removed from the approval of the variance. Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that application, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. I was curious, is that the longest
I believe it is.
Introduction you've ever had to read? At any rate, this item, the Board of Zoning Appeals did see before it in July of this year for two variances. Only one of those two variances is concerned in today's application. Back in July, you'll recall that they had requested, the East Main Church of Christ had requested two variances, the first of which was to allow parking in the required front yard, which is prohibited. That variance was granted. And the second variance was granted with the condition that you just read, was a variance to the 5-foot side landscape yard along the eastern property line adjacent to Dr. Smith's property, which is a white building that a white block building that almost sits right upon the property line that adjoins these two properties. As you'll recall, in the approval of this landscape variance, it was conditioned upon, as Chairman Rogers just read, that the the recorded ingress-egress easement that Dr. Smith had for his property along the eastern property line, because he does have an overhead door and a man door right there along the western side of his building, which would be the eastern property line of the subject property. And when he sold the property, he needed to retain access rights to be able to access those doors on the west side of his building. The original iteration of the plan, when the two variances were brought before the board back in July, showed a location for the entrance drive and for the access to his building that did not coincide with the recorded ingress-egress easement. And right now, I'll show you an overhead of the property, and then I'll approach the board and show you the differences between the two plans. Okay, these are the buildings the building that was torn down on the subject property that East Main Church of Christ has purchased and wishes to construct their parking lot upon. This building here is Dr. Smith's property, and the access easement runs along the adjoining property line. And what I have here on the board mounted before you, you don't have the old plan in your packages. You do have the new plan in front of you, though. The old plan, you'll recall, had the driveway ramp here off of East Vine Street, and that driveway ramp did not coincide with the 13-foot access easement that was to be used for the benefit of the adjoining property, the Smith property, to the east. This was the area that the church planned on leaving free of obstruction so that he could access those doors. But nonetheless, the access point and the access drive did not coincide with that easement. So that's why the board conditioned the approval upon the relocation of that easement so that the actual access would be consistent with the location of the existing easement. And you'll recall a representative of Dr. Smith spoke at the July meeting concerned about his rights to that easement, and so the landscape variance was conditioned upon that requirement. Now on the new plan, what they've done, and this plan has been approved administratively by the planning staff, subject to the board granting this amendment to the variance, is they've relocated their access drive to actually coincide with the location of the 13-foot ingress-egress easement, and they've removed the parallel parking that ran along this property line as well. So this 13-foot ingress-egress easement is completely unobstructed and is there to serve the purpose that it was intended to serve. With that being said, the condition that was placed upon the earlier landscape variance has essentially become a moot issue because the church has revised their plans to be consistent with that ingress-egress easement. We've advertised this as a public hearing today since we did have participation in our first public hearing. Although I have spoken with a representative of Dr. Smith, actually Mr. Nelms, who's representing Dr. Smith, and I gave him the information, and they seemed satisfied. Mr. Nelms seemed satisfied, and he was going to pass along to his client that the church's new plans were consistent with Dr. Smith's easement. But we do need to conduct a public hearing on this matter, and if the board sees fit, the proper motion would be to amend the variance approval to remove the condition that Chairman Rogers read earlier. I'll be happy to take any questions either before or after the public hearing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley? If not, then is Deacon Owens present?
Yes.
Okay. Deacon, is there anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
No, sir. No.
All right.
Everything's covered and good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then at this time we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward to the podium, state your name and your address and any comments that you might have. All right, seeing none, then we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussion or motion.
Mr. Chairman, if nobody has any other comments, I move for approval of their request to remove this prior condition consistent with the new plan that's been submitted.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that application has been granted. Thank you. Appreciate y'all coming in today. Okay, we'll move to variance requests. This is application Z08093 by Mr. Matt Taylor for SEC, Inc., for Mr. Mark Pirtle, requesting a 47-foot variance from the maximum required 52-foot front setback for principal structures in the Gateway Design Overlay GDO 4 zone for property located at 820 Medical Center Parkway, which is along the north side of Medical Center Parkway, east of Northwest Broad Street. And Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that application for us, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Subject property is a vacant lot in between the Quick Sack and the U.S. Bank Shopping Center along the north side of Medical Center Parkway, just east of Northwest Broad Street. It's affectionately known as the Mark Pirtle Rock Lot because of the large rock that sits in the middle of it. At any rate, this item has been before the Planning Commission for initial design review, and the applicant presented this variance to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission forwarded this on to the Board of Zoning Appeals prior to final design review without any kind of objection or reservation about the proposed variance. And I'll show you the location on the overhead now. Here's the intersection of Medical Center Parkway and Broad Street. It's the Quicksack, the Hardee's, and this is the lot right here. There's the rock, as a matter of fact. And this is the U.S. Bank site that actually borders it on the east and on the north side. In the GDO4 zoning district, which is the specific GDO district that this is located in, there is actually a maximum front building setback. There is a minimum building setback and a maximum front building setback. And it's not something that that the board hears variances on often, or that we even have to regulate often, because it's that maximum front building setback is almost exclusive to the GDO4 zoning district. And the way the zoning ordinance reads is that the maximum front building setback is 10 feet greater than the minimum front building setback in that zoning district. So there's a minimum front building setback of 42 feet in this commercial highway zoning district, and the GDO4 zoning district dictates that the front of the building can be no further away than 52 feet from the front property line, trying to create some type of uniformity and some type of streetscape along Medical Center Parkway. The applicant finds himself in a bit of a tight spot in this situation, because quite frankly, it's a tight lot. It's a very small lot at 0.3 acres, I believe, Mr. Taylor. Yes, about 0.3 acres, and he would like to build a 2,400 square foot retail and office building. And the reason that he has requested the variance is that in order to be able to meet the maximum front building setback, the building itself would of course need to be pushed up further towards the front than he is able to put it, and the parking would need to be in the rear. In order to do that, he just does not have enough lot width to get a driveway aisle around the building, and the size of the building is only proposed to be 2,400 square feet. And I always find it helps to have some visuals. Here's the lot itself. Here's the 2,400 square foot proposed retail office building. And you'll see in Mr. Taylor's package, he has noted the minimum building setback line and the maximum building setback line. So this 10-foot area right here technically is the only 10 feet that the front of the building can be located on. So the building would have to be pushed up this area, and parking would have to be in the rear. And with the lot frontage, that would be without making the building have a strange orientation toward the street, and making it long and skinny and narrow, running perpendicular to the street. He's decided instead to make it parallel to the street and to request this variance. Now, the U.S. Bank Shopping Center also requested a variance to this provision back in 2004, I believe. So they are actually, the front of the U.S. Bank building is actually somewhat greater of a distance back from the Medical Center Parkway right-of-way, as you'll see illustrated in this aerial photograph. You've got the Quicksack right here, the proposed building here on the Mark Pirtle Rock lot, and then the U.S. Bank building here. And the applicant contends that this will make a nice transition for the line of sight, so that it transitions back from the Quicksack back to the U.S. Bank building for the view shed there. Now, I did allude to to the U.S. Bank site. They received a 73-foot variance, and the applicant's variance is for 47-foot. It's for a 47-foot variance, and staff erred on the side of caution, making that measurement to the front wall of the building and not the front porch. The front porch is actually closer to the front property line than that request, but we thought we'd err on the side of caution. If the board wishes to approve this variance request, staff recommends the following condition. The development must receive final design review, site plan approval from the Murfreesboro Planning Commission. And number 2, a surveyor will be required to help lay out the footing of the building, and a surveyor's certification must be provided that the building is in compliance with the action of the BZA as well as all other setback requirements. It is proposed to be located right on the 20-foot minimum rear building setback line. So we would want to make sure that a surveyor were to certify that it is in compliance with the action of the board and of all other setbacks. I'll be happy to answer any questions either before or after the public hearing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Plumlee, I have one. Does the parking requirement, does it matter whether it's a single occupant or a multiple occupant office? Because you got 10 spaces.
They're actually, with the 10 spaces, they would meet it if it was single or double occupant. 5 spaces are required per user in an office or retail use.
Okay.
So the 10 spaces would mean that if there are 2 tenants, they would be exceeding the maximum number. If it's just one tenant, or if it's 2 tenants, they would be meeting the number of parking spaces. If it's just one tenant, they would be slightly exceeding it.
Okay.
No other questions, then we'll go ahead and, Mr. Taylor, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir? Okay. We'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussion or motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to approve the variance with the 2 conditions that are set by the staff.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, Mr. Taylor, that application's been granted. Thank you very much. Okay, next is application Z08094 by Mr. Dan Decker for Salem Glen Self-Storage, requesting a variance from the requirement that a Type C buffer must be installed on property zoned commercial fringe where it abuts property zoned residential zero lot line, RZ, for property located at 3450 Glenside Court. The applicant is seeking a waiver of the requirement to install a Type C buffer along the northern property line. Mr. Blomley, if you'd review that application, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Property is located at 3450 Glenside Court and is zoned CF Commercial Fringe. The property is currently being developed as the Salem Glen Self-Storage Development. Mr. Decker owns and operates this facility. Phase 1 is complete, and Phase 2 is nearing completion but has not yet received a certificate of occupancy. Phase 2, as you'll see in the overhead here, Phase 2 is on the north side of the development. Phase 1, when this photograph was taken in 2007, was complete. Since then, Phase 2 has been constructed and is near completion. Also, you'll recall on the property to the north, earlier this year you saw an application for a special use permit for a church in an RZ zoning district. The property to the north is zoned RZ, residential zero lot line. That's the College Heights Chapel, and that was approved for a special use permit earlier this year. Mr. Decker has made this application in the hopes of being granted a variance to the Type D buffer requirement when CF abuts the RZ zoning district. As you know, buffers are determined by abutting zoning districts, and whenever a more intense zoning district abuts a less intense zoning district, a type of buffer is required, and that buffer is determined by the chart in our zoning ordinance. In the case of when a CF piece of property abuts an RZ piece of property, a type D buffer, which is a 15-foot wide continuous row of evergreen plantings, is required along that property line on the side of the property zoned CF. Mr. Decker's contention is that because of the approval of the church, the need for the buffer no longer exists. So in other words, even though the zoning has not changed and still CF to RZ, that the approval of the church to the north and the fact that the church is having to install a buffer along its northern property line to the single-family development to the north of the church discounts the need for any type of buffer on the self-storage lot. What Mr. Decker proposes to do is, instead of the type D buffer along the property line, he proposes to do the traditional side planting yard, but to add a few shrubs as well. This is the side planting yard on the south side of the development, which abuts the rest of the commercial subdivision with the Walgreens and the vet clinic. But you'll see how it's just planted with trees, every 25 feet off center for ornamental trees or 40 feet off center for shade trees. And Mr. Decker plans to add some shrubbery intermittently along the northern property line as well, as shown on the attached site plan. Mr. Decker also points to the fact that there is very little activity associated with a self-storage development. This is actually the side of the building, the north side of the building along the northern property line facing the church property, which you can see is under construction here when these pictures were taken. And so you would just envision what you saw along in the last photograph along the southern property line, along this property line with some additional shrubs, and that's what Mr. Decker is proposing. What you'll also find in your agenda materials a letter from the College Heights Chapel elders, which include Mr. Decker, stating that they have no opposition to this proposal. With that being said, if the board does approve this request, staff recommends the following condition: a revised landscape plan must be submitted for final review and approval by the city horticulturist. And right now what I'll do is just approach the board and show you all the revised plan. I always like it facing north. Here is where the type D buffer would go. They have overlaid the church building and the parking lot and driveway aisles. This property line is in closest proximity to a driveway aisle and the dumpster, and so what they're proposing to do is have the shade trees 40 feet off center and 4 shrubs in between each of the shade trees, which would be on the side of that building facing the church. That being said, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. Mr. Decker is here as well if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Baumley. Any questions for Mr. Baumley?
On what they're proposing versus the type D, is there a way to put what they're proposing into the alphabetical scale? To get an idea of what we're...
It's not a buffer. It's just what he's proposing to do is do basic side perimeter planting yard that we would that you would see, for example, on the south side of the property, except add a few shrubs in there as well. So he's essentially seeking a waiver of the buffer requirements. this wouldn't be a type A, B, C, D, E. It just wouldn't be a buffer.
Mr. Blumley, if we were to grant this, are we setting ourselves up for variances along the rest of this commercial development that back up to this church?
I do think that, as far as precedent setting, I may leave that to Mr. Ives. But as we saw in the ride-around this morning, there are additional vacant properties, or at least one additional vacant lot that abut the church property. So, which future developers of that lot, for example, would not. But I'm sure that would be something that they would look into, because I'm sure they would, depending on the intensity of their use, may feel that it would be appropriate for them to come and seek the same kind of relief.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Decker, is anything you'd like to add to this application?
No, I'm glad to answer any questions you want to.
Any questions from Mr. Decker?
Mr. Decker, if you don't mind, the lot that's in front of your storage buildings there, how much of those lots share a property line with that church? Does that make any sense, coming down along this south side of the church, north side of that property?
Yes, sir. I think I understand what you're saying. Those lots would be the remainder of the southern property line of the church property.
So it runs all the way back down to the...
It would run the full length of the church property to the east. Yes,
on
sir.
that commercial development?
Yes, sir.
Undeveloped lot.
They front on Glenside Court at the storage units.
But, Mr. Dunn, I think I can answer that question too. I'm looking at if you look at the map on the front of the staff comments, there is only one lot that goes all the way out to Glenside Court. That's not to say that it couldn't be subdivided in the future into additional lots, but you'll see where for the majority of the northern property line for Lot 4 of the Salem Glen commercial subdivision, that does abut the church property.
Okay.
A small portion of the front of it abuts commercial property along St. Andrews Drive.
That's what it doesn't go all the way to St. Andrews, but it goes to...
Probably a good 75% of the way on that lot.
Matthew, just so I'm clear, there's not any practical difficulties in doing this buffer other than just wanting relief from it. There's space there to put in the required, there's all that stuff is there. It's just wanting relief from having to put it there. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, I got a little lost based upon Mr. Dodd's question. Are we saying that the way it's zoned currently, that there would be an area from St. Andrews to a certain extension of this area that a buffer would be required if we were to grant this variance today?
No. This variance would only apply to the lot at 3450 Glenside Court.
Okay, but let's take it one step further. Let's just, for arguments, well, I don't know if we can do this or not. Is there an area that butts up to this church that is contiguous with St. Andrews Drive that is not contiguous with this church property?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, let me put it on the overhead so everybody can see. All right, let's see. All right, here is Mr. Decker's self-storage development. This yellow is the church here. Lot 4 of the Salem Glen commercial subdivision goes all the way from the self-storage lot all the way down Glenside Court to St. Andrews Drive. And so for the majority of its northern property line, it shares a common property line with the church property. Except for this little area here closer to St. Andrews Drive, it shares a property line with a small commercially zoned lot along the entrance to the church property in St. Andrews Drive.
So, I think you've just answered my question. So Lot 5 is commercially zoned today, correct? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So just for argument's sake, if that was remain zone commercial, and we were to grant this area along Lot 6, and assuming that we're probably going to get the same request on Lot 4, Lot 5 would not require any type of buffer because they're both zoned, 4 and 5 are zoned the same, correct?
From this map, there's I think this is the zoning line right here. There's a CF and an OG zoning line, and I believe that the OG starts along the southern property line of the drive for the church. So yes, this would be like zoning. However, you might also consider the fact that if this is zoned commercial fringe right here, the same possibility exists for Lot 5 that it does for Lot 4, that the rear property line of Lot 5 also abuts the church. But along this property line here, if this is commercial fringe and not office general, there would be no buffer required along this property line right here.
So, Mr. Decker, I just would have a question for you. I mean, to me, what you're setting the church up for is a request, and you may own all this property for all I know, but you are setting yourself up for a variance for each one of these properties that abut up to this church that are not going to have any, or will have a limited buffer. And I don't know if you can speak for the church or not. I know you're a member of the church, but is the church going to be okay with that? You see what I'm asking?
I do, Mr. Halburn. And my thought would be that due to what we are presenting here, as far as the type building that is backing up the church on this lot, would be an attractive masonry, basically a wall, no activity at all. That's why we felt like it was not needed to have that buffer there. I would assume that if in fact, when we develop those other lots, and we do in fact own those lots.
Including 5?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. That, I mean, I would be surprised if we had the same application there we do here, that we would probably have some activity or parking area or something like that that might deem a buffer needed. But with what we're proposing, or actually what is in place right now, being this masonry brick and block wall, we feel like the standard perimeter landscaping would be attractive and adequate because of this, is my thought. So I would think that the church would have no problem if there was no more activity than what is presented with this application, would be my thought.
Okay. I understand your point. I think, though, if you were to sell let's say I was to buy Lot 4 from you.
Yes, sir.
I might ask for the same perimeter that you received, even though, and I understand your point about the block wall, but I might ask for the same variance if I were to own that Lot 4 in the end and expect it to be granted.
Yes, sir. I guess my thought would be if someone came before this board and presented something that had a lot more activity or was not as attractive as this, that y'all wouldn't grant that.
Okay.
And that the church would object if it was going to be something different, is my thought.
All right.
I think where this comes in is that puts us as the arbitrator of what's a lot of activity and what's not. I mean, I guess it's hard to argue that this wall on the storage unit doesn't have a lot of activity. Then if 4 and 5 come back and argue, well, we don't have that much, then it kind of puts us in a position where we're really choosing buffers based on use or expected use or represented use as opposed to a straight zoning determination of what the buffer is or shouldn't be. I think maybe that's our concern. I think that we're now going to have to take it on a case by case based on use or proposed use or however that goes. At least that's mine. I guess I won't speak for the board, but that's just my only concern. I don't really have an argument with what you're saying, but my concern is really more for the other lots in the future and where it puts us in a position of having to arbitrate when it's warranted and when it's not, just based on what the proposed or use is going to be.
Yes, sir. I understand what you're saying. I guess my thought would be in the future, if someone asked for a variance there, the church would certainly be glad to render their opinion if they weren't satisfied with what was going there.
I have to say that I feel exactly the same way that Mr. Dodd and Mr. Halliburton feels. I know so many times that we've had this problem come up, and we just want to be consistent on what we do, is what I would be interested in doing as a member.
Chairman Rogers, I would add that I really have to question whether the board has the authority to grant this kind of a variance. There certainly is no showing of a hardship. And I understand everybody wants to save money, and maybe today more than we did a few months ago, but there's no extraordinary difficulty because of an unusual characteristic of either of these properties. I believe that we have buffer yards between, for a residential zoned lot, which happens to be used by a church in a number of situations. And I think the buffer yard is partly to shield from the use that's adjacent, and it's also in part just to create green space and environmental for environmental beneficent. Can't say the right word, but for the benefit of the environment as well. I'm not sure about a precedent in terms of the lot next door. Certainly, I would argue that this sets a precedent. I'm not sure it would be a binding precedent, but I certainly think it would open up a lot of requests where people feel that the uses are not all that incompatible, and therefore we shouldn't have to put up a buffer. And the use on both of these tracks will someday change. Now, these are new facilities. Well, I guess one's under construction, or both of them are under construction, I guess. They won't change probably in the very near future, but someday they will change. And then you'd have a question of, well, does the buffer waiver follow with the new use or not? And it'd be my thought that we're creating some risk to grant this kind of a variance.
And I would remind the board that we have not had the public hearing on this yet.
That's right. All right. Thank you, Mr. Baum. Any other questions for anyone before we get started with the public hearing? Okay, then at this time we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward. And seeing none, we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for further discussion or motion.
My line of thinking was, I guess, what Mr. Ives came along and looking at what hardships were there, what makes it an exception. I didn't see that either. And I guess with that said, I'll make a motion to deny the request.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on that motion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, Mr. Decker, that application has been denied.
For your consideration.
Thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda under special use permit request, application Z08095 by Mr. Steve Steele of Huddleston Steel Engineering for Cason Lane Church of Christ, requesting a special use permit in order to expand an existing institutional group assembly use, a church, in a residential single-family RS-10, RS-12, and RS-15 zone. for property located at 1110 Cason Lane. The applicant is also requesting a time extension to the church's approval to use 2 portable classroom buildings on the same property. And Mr. Blum, if you'd review that application, please.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. As you mentioned, the subject property is located at 1110 Cason Lane, which is along the west side of Cason Lane, just to the south of Azure Way and just to the north of Wellington Place. There's been an existing church there for approximately 10 years. The Board of Zoning Appeals first considered a special use permit for the subject property in December of 1997, when a special use permit for the church building was approved. The original site plan presented to the BZA showed the construction of a 14,500 square foot building. Phase 1, consisting of a 9,833 square foot building, was constructed shortly after the original special use permit was approved. The applicant has come back before you today requesting a 10,718 square foot addition, which brings the total requested square footage to 20,600, which far exceeds the 14,500 square feet that was approved back in 1997. Thus, the church is making this application for the expansion. The existing church building does face Cason Lane. The parking is along the sides and in the rear of the existing church building. The applicant is not really seeking to do any kind of site modifications except the proposed building addition and to relocate some portables, which I'll go over in just a moment. One of the things that I asked you to consider in my staff comments that were sent to you with your agenda packages was the buffering or the existing screening, and I wanted the board to contemplate what they felt was adequate. Right now, what I'll show you are some photographs submitted by the design engineer. As you know, typically when we have a church in a residential zoning district, during my tenure with the Board of Zoning Appeals, which has been about 2.5 years, we typically require a Type C buffer when a church use abuts other single-family residential uses. There are a number of existing trees from both from when this site was developed and existing trees along existing tree lines predating the site. This is along the rear property line. You can see it's predominantly a deciduous tree line, and all the leaves are off of them at this time. And you can see the residential uses behind this tree line. There's a good bit of land in between the back of the parking lot and the houses to the rear of the church. This is the side property line, the south side property line, and there are several trees from when the church was originally constructed and the site was developed. This is along the northern property line. You can see there's a good bit more undergrowth along the northern property line. This is a view of the front of the church from Cason Lane and the south access aisle off Cason Lane. Another view of the church from Cason Lane. And finally, another view from Cason Lane looking along the north access aisle. The proposed addition will be all brick as shown here on the elevations. The building will be one story and will match the existing building in appearance. mentioned before that there were 2 portables on site. Here are those 2 portables here that are to the rear of the church building. And what I'd like to do now is give you some history on those portables because, as you read, Chairman Rogers, that was part of the request, is for a time extension for those portables. In December 1999, the planning staff administratively approved the placement of 2 23 by 60 portable classrooms on site on a temporary basis. In September of 2002, the portables still had not been removed, so the planning staff required the church to appear before the BZA and formally request a time extension for the portables. The BZA approved the request for 3 years or until after the completion of Phase 2, with the understanding that the church was going to commence construction on Phase 2 within those 3 years. In November 2006, the planning staff made an inquiry as to why the portables had not been removed. A representative from the church said that Phase 2 was in the works and that the church anticipated beginning construction within 12 months of November 2006. The church did occasionally contact the planning staff over the course of the last 2 years, but no formal application by the church to move forward with Phase 2 has been made until now. In conjunction with the church's request to expand, they are also seeking a time extension to the portable classrooms. The request is to be able to continue to use the portables during the construction of the addition and then to remove the portables prior to the issuance of the certificate of occupancy. The portables are proposed to be located as shown on the site plan. Staff is in favor of modifying or conditioning the request to put a finite time limit on the approval of the portables. Staff does not want to repeat the cycle of allowing the portables indefinitely until Phase 2 is completed because there is no guarantee that construction of Phase 2 will ever commence or be completed, as we've experienced since the portables have been up for approximately 9 years now. So any approval of a time extension on those portables, staff recommends that the 2 portables must be removed from the site prior to the issuance of the certificate of occupancy for the building addition, or no later than 18 months from the date of BZA approval, whichever comes first. So that way, we know that there is a finite maximum amount of time that those portables can be out there, and staff feels that 18 months is more than enough time to complete the building addition, because the site plan has actually already gone through the planning staff's review process and is now it's in good. The site plan is in good shape, and upon approval from the Board of Zoning Appeals, we'll be heading to the Planning Commission for approval in pretty short order. Just now to show you the layout of the existing site. As I mentioned, there are 2 driveway aisles, one along the north and one along the south side of the site. The existing building is in this shape here, and the proposed addition would be mainly rectangular with a small jut out along the back side. The existing classrooms would be relocated here, the existing portable classrooms, for the duration of the Phase 2 project. The area where the portables are now would be curbed and some additional landscaping added. The applicant is proposing to add some additional landscaping in some of the other areas of the site to landscape islands, for example. In response to staff's inquiries regarding beefing up the existing landscaping or possibly even going to a Type C buffer, which is what we customarily require now, we may not have required back in '97 when this was originally approved. They have added some additional landscaping, but staff is of the opinion that the amount of landscaping that's been added on the revised plans is not adequate. The plan's been shown to Ms. Holloway, our city horticulturist, and she's here to answer any questions that you might have of her. But they haven't done very much to address the inadequacy of the existing buffer and filling in those gaps. As you saw by the photographs and by our ride around this morning, the trees, especially in the back, are almost 100% deciduous and don't offer much of a buffer at all during the winter months. So as I mentioned, something for the board to consider what you feel is appropriate screening in this instance. The board approves the request for the special use permit building expansion. Staff recommends the following conditions. The Planning Commission must grant site plan approval for the proposed development. As a function of its site plan, the Planning Commission will also have final architectural review of the building, and all building orientation requirements must be met to the satisfaction of the Planning Commission. And number 2, the landscape plan will be subject to the final review and approval of the city horticulturist. As I mentioned, Ms. Holloway's here. If you have any questions for her, I'll be happy to answer any questions before or after the public hearing. I would say that both of the aspects of the special use permit request should be taken in separate motions. Mr. Steve Steele with Huddleston Steel Engineering is here representing the church, if you have any questions for him.
All right, thank you, Mr. Blomley. Any questions for Mr. Blomley?
Mr. Blomley, the buffering that appears on the west and the east with the trees that are in place, are you saying that that was not a condition of the approval? That's just voluntary tree or natural growth there, or?
Yeah, in looking at the old files, it appeared that the applicants didn't seek to plant a buffer, nor were they required by the Board of Zoning Appeals at the time of approval, and that the natural tree line along the western, which would be the rear, and the northern side property line were all that was required at that time. And based on the conceptual site plan that was submitted with the 1997 special use permit, it did not approve that anything. It did not appear that anything above and beyond that was required with the approval.
Mr. Blomley, we ran into this issue about with that church on Manny Avenue about orienting it toward the street. This is one being, I guess, built in 1997 where that ordinance wasn't in place, so it doesn't apply.
That's correct. Plus, the front of the structure is already built. It's essentially what we're looking at now is something that's to the rear of the existing structure.
Yeah, I was just curious about that. The second question I have is, so how close to the western property boundary is this addition going to be?
It's they have quite a bit of land to the rear of the building. It's at a 50 scale. Looks like it's probably about, if I had to say, 200 feet from the western property line to the rear parking lot.
Okay.
Is that, Mr. Steele, is that about correct? He's nodding. And then probably another 100 feet. So I'd say the building addition is probably 300 feet from that western property line.
Okay. The pictures are a little deceptive. Thank you, Mr. Blomley. Mr. Steele, anything you'd like to add to this application, sir?
Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'm Steve Steele, and I'm with Huddleston Steel Engineering. I have helped the church put together the packet that you're looking at. I also have with me today Mr. Joey Ryan, who is with Dow Smith Construction. He will be building this addition if it is approved by you all in the Planning Commission. And also with me today is Mr. Brent Beckham with the church and 2 other church members that would be prepared to answer any operational questions about the addition. If I could, I'll address landscaping just a little since we've talked about that quite a bit. Yes, pictures can be deceiving, but let me assure you, those weren't Matthew's pictures, those were our pictures. When we took them, we were just trying to show what was out there. It looks closer than it is. As Matthew mentioned, it's about 200 feet from the rear parking lot to the adjoining property to the west, and about 300 feet from the proposed building addition. We also did the original site plan that went through Planning Commission back in 1998. At that time, the tree line that is on the north, which is at the top of your drawing, at the top of the drawing on the easel, and the tree line that is on the west, which is on the left side, that was shown as an existing tree line to remain. So that's what was approved by Planning Commission, and that's what you see out there today is an old farm tree line that's been cleaned out, and all the major trees are there. The trees that are along the south or the bottom line were proposed, and those were planted by the church 10 years ago. We did try to fill in the gaps that we saw in the buffer, if you will, but I do stand here before you to tell you that the church wants to do whatever you and or the Planning Commission want them to do as far as the landscaping, because they understand the potential impact that could have on neighbors. So we have shown you what's there, have made a proposal of what we might do, but if you see something greater that needs to be done, I feel certain the church will do what you ask them to do. I'll be glad to answer any other questions at the appropriate time, or if you have some now.
All right, thank you, Mr. Steele. Any questions for Mr. Steele?
Mr. Steele, I have one. I think there's maybe two questions in my mind regarding the landscaping at the west side. One is the amount appropriate as we're looking at today? That's one question. The second question, which I think y'all will need to answer, we wouldn't, but y'all's property line is a considerable amount of distance between this existing tree line to the west to where your actual property line is. And if the BZA approved this plan based upon a heavier buffer, let's say, would you want it there where that existing tree line is today, or would you want it on your actual property line where you're not having, if you do expand even further in the rear, where you're not having to do it twice, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I don't know if we're prepared to answer that today. What?
No, we haven't considered the possibility of doing that.
Okay.
We haven't considered that possibility.
All right. That answers my question.
Thank you.
If I may pose a question to them about the likelihood of, I mean, they do have quite a bit of land back there. Is it their intention? Do they have a master plan that they want to pursue at some point in the future of developing that back third of the property?
At this time, our plan is not to go back in.
If you don't mind.
If we can get you to come forward to the podium, state your name and address, and
I'm Brent Beckham, with a member at Case Lane Church, and the only plans that we have for that rear field will be if we need parking in the future. We have done a master plan, and at this time we do not consider it feasible to expand our auditorium on the property. We don't feel like we have enough property to do that, and so a need for more buildings is not foreseen. But parking could be, if our membership grows and parking is needed, that's where we will grow to, is in that rear field. But at this time we don't see that as a need.
My name is Joey Ryan. I'm the general contractor for the church. We're just asking for the maximum amount of 20,600 square feet, which the church, with this request, would be building up to that maximum. So anything above and beyond that, if I'm not mistaken, would have to come before the board again for we'll call it phase 3 on the rear buffer yard behind the property, that 200 feet that's in question. So I think we're maxing out our request now, and would have to come back before the board again if they decided to go on with a phase 3 building or parking lot extension. If I'm not mistaken, Matthew can speak to that better than I could.
Yep, and Mr. Ryan, I think what they're getting at is if they make y'all put in a substantial amount more landscaping than is shown on this plan, then I think the point they're trying to make is that that may not be the most practical thing for all parties to do, because if the church plans on making that parking at some point, 10 years down the road, then all that vegetation would have to come down, and you'd have to plant a new buffer instead of planning for it at the rear property line, and then that allowing you to go back in the future without having to alter that.
I think from a practical standpoint, the closer we can get, if we did extend it, the closer we could get the landscaping buffer to the property line would be the better, because we would need as much room as we could. If we were going to plant something for long term. We would need to keep as close to the property line as we could. That way, it wouldn't obstruct any future expansion or additions.
Chairman Rogers, can I ask, the portables, will they be used in that 18-month period when you're going to?
They will. Construction, assuming the church will move forward, if we start construction in February, we should be done in a 6 to 8 month time period. So they'll be using them on a temporary basis, being on temporary power. And the church has made plans to move those out prior to if the board approves an 18-month period, move those out to either a new buyer or off the property.
And you are talking about moving them fairly close to that existing tree line in the rear? Or
Temporarily? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Ms. Holloway, anything you'd like to add about the buffer?
No, I think everything that you're saying about putting an additional buffer, if that's what you...
Can I get you to...
Would make sense to put it, along the property line. I asked a question about the portables because they are going to be sitting, of course, closer, to the residential and in use for, I guess, maybe 18 months. That's a year and a half. So you are kind of pushing that activity closer, and there really wouldn't be, I don't know how close you're going to get to the existing tree line, but it's probably going to have some effect on it. And there may not be room to put some additional buffering material if you're going to put the portables in there. It makes sense to put it, if you require it, to me, on the back property line. I think just common sense dictates that. And you are pushing the activity temporarily closer to the single-family houses. So that was my observation. That's why I asked about the portables at this time, too.
And I'm sorry, Ms. Holloway, I think we're going to have some questions for you. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Would they receive any, I think I have a twofold question. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it. Would they receive any credit from a buffer for the existing trees that are there? Or, I guess, is there a width within the property line where the buffer is required to be?
They would get credit for it.
Even though it's not on the line?
Right, they would. We just, I think they need to supplement it with more evergreens. And, it is an old tree row, and what they've done is done a good job of keeping it cleaned out, which sometimes is to their detriment. I mean, if you let the privet grow up, it does tend to make for a better buffer. But they would get credit for some of those trees, absolutely. But I think you saw today that it doesn't really, it's not real effective the way it is today, but certainly they would get credit. And in my mind's eye, I was thinking something, maybe even a single, evergreen row along the back row or something along that line.
Can I follow up his question? Are you saying that they would get credit even though if we were to propose this buffer to be on the property line versus where that tree line is today?
Yeah, I mean, and we give, because it's in the rear, it will add to some, especially in the summertime.
Okay.
But they will get credit for it. I mean,
and so what happens when they expand the parking lot? Then we would just ask them to
supplement
do something at
again,
that point.
We would probably come back, and if you felt it
I see.
necessary on the rear to add if in the future.
Makes sense.
And I will have to say that our buffering system and ordinance was not in effect back in 1997 or 98 is one of the reasons, as Mr. Rogers pointed out, that our new ordinance didn't take effect till 2000. So.
No, so that comes around, I guess, to what I'm trying to. If we required a buffer, there's no requirement for them to place that buffer on that property line. They could choose to cut off their yard there and buffer inside their property line. There's no requirement for that.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Y'all could require them to
place it on the back.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I would caution you is there is a drainage easement along that rear property line that we wouldn't want it to be right along the rear property line. We would want the buffer to stay out of that drainage easement because it looks like that's That's, looks like it's an open ditch, and Mr. Steele could verify.
That's correct.
So we, we prefer, they've got plenty of room back there. We prefer that buffer to not be in that open ditch.
Ms. Holloway, I'm trying to get in my mind just the sheer scope of what we're trying to ask them to undertake. As you've recommended a Type C buffer, we know they're going to get some credit, and the comments have been they need to plant a few more evergreen trees. Exactly how much are we talking about, to bring this up to where you think it should be?
In my opinion, I would like to see them run probably just a strictly 100% evergreen, maybe single or slightly staggered line as close to the back of the property line as they could get. I don't have the linear footage, so I can't, really, in my mind, tell you the numbers. But, we like to see something, and they are going to get credit for some of those deciduous trees. It becomes a number game then. We just have to look at it. What they did was they just went in on this plan and added a few 4-foot-tall evergreens, 1 or 2 or 3 along that back to kind of plug in, and then around that kind of corner where there wasn't anything, they put the trees on pretty wide spacing, 6 foot. I don't feel like that's adequate. I think typically a Type C buffer would be 15 foot, deep and fairly, it'd be pretty dense going in. But I think maybe a single row or a slightly offset row of evergreens along the back portion there would probably, I think, benefit the residents more than just trying to plug in a few things, and it's going to be difficult to get things underneath an established tree row like that with roots and everything. So I think it just makes sense to push it, maybe a single row back there. I'm sorry I can't give you the numbers because I don't really have the linear footage.
Are we still just plugging in those stuff in the northern and southern boundaries? Are we just plugging stuff in there?
There, yes.
Type C?
Yeah, we would just plug in, kind of fill in the gaps there.
Okay, so not terribly substantial there in the north and south. We're really talking about the vast majority of the work's going to be if there's a Type C buffer along the western property boundary.
Yeah, and you'll see how there's a gap between the existing tree line and that rear property line. I would say to connect or to
fill in.
Yeah, to connect the this area here, which would connect if you required them to do the evergreen screen along the rear property line, like we've been discussing, do the same thing along the northern and southern property lines to connect the existing vegetation with the proposed vegetation along the rear property line, and then in the remainder fill in the gaps as they have shown and as we've discussed.
All right, thank you, Ms. Holloway. At this time, then, we'll go ahead and conduct a public hearing. Anyone present wishing to speak for or against this application, if you would, please come forward and state your name and address, please.
My name is Nicole Kennedy. I live at 2806 Wellington Place, which is the corner there of the church.
Do you know your lot? We've got a plat here with lot numbers on it. Happen to know your
Well,
lot
in
number?
picture number 2, that's my backyard, if you want to show me.
You're right in the corner,
Yeah. And I just want to point out, if you look at the pictures that were shown earlier, when you're on Caseton Lane and you're looking at the church over to this side, there's quite a bit of land. There is an existing tree line, there is a drainage ditch, and then there are additional houses. At the back of the property, okay, you've got some land, you've got an existing tree line, you've got some more land before you come up to the houses. I just want to point out that on this side, when you're facing the church on Caseton Lane, okay, on this side is my house, and that fence right there is my backyard. There is nothing but just a few trees, and there is noise. And so I would just ask that you would take all of that into consideration. Those houses on that side are a lot closer to the church than the back or this side as well. So the noise is a concern of mine for the people that do live there. that are property owners. When are they saying that this would be completed, the building, and how long will those portables be back there? And how long have they been in violation is a concern of mine, and what means that they're going to do what they're going to say that they're going to do now. Because it affects the people who want to sell their homes. It really does.
Maybe Mr.
That
Blomley-
much activity in the backyard makes a big difference.
Okay, maybe Mr. Blomley can answer some of those questions for you.
Sure. I believe what they said as far as the time frame would be that from the time that they're approved by the Planning Commission with their site plan, and then I think they would hope to get permitted in February, and I believe they said it was a 6 to 8 month project. So you'd be looking at sometime in late 2009 before they would be complete as they've laid out the schedule. As far as how long the portables have been in violation, it's been a little over 3 years now. And as we've laid out in the staff conditions is that we recommend to the board that portables be allowed to stay there no longer than 18 months or until a certificate of occupancy is issued for the addition, whichever comes first. So if they're planning on finishing in late 2009 before they could occupy the addition, the portables would have to be removed.
But they have had a building permit before, correct? That they haven't followed through with the expansion on the building.
I'm not aware of one. I don't know.
I
the
thought that
answer to
was
question.
mentioned.
They've made. Go ahead.
It was a special use permit, the same as they're seeking right now. They had a special use permit granted for a Phase 2 building that was not as large in size as this Phase 2 building. So they had to go before the Board of Zoning Appeals before. But now they're looking to have a larger addition for Phase 2 than they did initially. But no building permit was ever issued for Phase 2.
Okay. I'm not going to oppose anything at all whatsoever or make things difficult for, everybody else involved. I just want everybody to take into consideration that those houses are right there on that property line. And I would like that you give some sort of buffer, and take into consideration the people that do live there, because a lot of times when a person goes to sell their home, it's not as desirable if you've got a whole lot of nasty activity in the backyard, whether that be construction or portables. The way the portables are right now, they're hidden by the church. You don't see them unless you are in it. If you lay them on the back of the property line, they're going to lay sideways. It's going to be visible from the street. It will not be as... I'm just asking that you take all of that into consideration. Thanks.
And I'm sorry, can you tell me your name one more time?
Nicole Kennedy.
Kennedy. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Any questions for Ms. Kennedy? All right. Thank you, ma'am. Anyone else wishing to speak for or against this application? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Tim Morrison. I'm one of the elders of the congregation there at Casey Lane. I would just like to address a little bit of her concerns. It's our every intent to be a good neighbor and to do what we can to protect the neighborhood from any noise and inconvenience during this period of time that we're under construction. It is our full intent to remove the portables as quickly as possible for our own personal goals and objectives of providing better classroom environment and more classroom space. So we fully intend to be rid of those as quickly as possible. We fully intend to comply with any of the requirements that the BZA would place on us as far as buffers, things of that nature, and to meet any of the additional requirements you might have on us at this time to move forward.
All right, thank you, Mr. Morrison. Any questions for Mr. Morrison? Thank you, sir. Anyone else present wishing to speak for or against this application?
I do want to mention one other thing. I think that, everybody wants to get along and everybody wants to be a good neighbor and all of that, and I'm all, on board with all of that, but I do want to remind you that those homes are vinyl-sided homes. and there's almost, there's just so much, there is noise. I mean, you guys are great, you're nice, and I don't want to be difficult. I just ask that you take all of that into consideration, because they are just vinyl-sided homes, and there is a little bit more noise, in that situation.
All right, well, if there's no one else wishing to speak, then we'll go ahead and declare the public hearing closed and open the floor for any further discussion or motion.
Mr. Blomley, is there anything that keeps us, even though there was no type C required, there was some existing vegetation on these north and south property lines, and even though this addition is not toward the front of the property, if we were inclined to have a buffer, is there anything that prohibits us from requiring a buffer on all three of these boundaries with credit for what's there?
I don't believe so. I believe, and Mr. Ives can verify that would be an appropriate condition, but I think that with the increase in activity associated with a building expansion, that bringing all three property lines up to a type C buffer, I think that would be, if that's what the board chose, I think that would be an appropriate condition. Mr. Ives would.
I agree. From my reading of the landscape portion of the zoning ordinance, I believe that it is they can be required to bring the entire lot up to standards with this addition.
I think that would be my preference. I don't know what the board, I don't know how you guys feel, but I mean, if we're going to, and I don't know what this amounts to. It seems to me that this south property line may already be close to that, at least the part that has the trees on it, but it just seemed to me that a buffer is definitely needed along the west, and it would seem, I don't know if unfair is the right word, but it seems that folks up here would deserve as much buffering as the folks in the back, even though there is some existing. They'd be able to get credit for what they already have there and just try to bring it up to the whole property up to the buffering.
And Mr. Dodd, certainly that's why we have great experts in various fields on city staff, and I count Ms. Holloway among those that she would be able to work with the church in determining how much additional plantings would be required along any property lines that you choose to require any type of buffer on, and certainly appropriate credit would be given where there is existing vegetation, and that would be, any existing vegetation would be counted, so it wouldn't be like going in and having to plant a brand new type C buffer. It would just be adding to the vegetation that's already there, kind of shoring it up a little bit.
And you wanted us to take, how did you want us to break this down by? You wanted two motions.
Yeah, I think that we would need a motion on the special use permit for the building expansion,
and on the portables,
and a separate one on the portables as well.
And the first motion on the granting to, assuming it's to grant the special use permit, would be conditioned on the type of
buffering,
additional landscaping or buffering, if any, that the board would see fit to require.
Mr. Chairman, with that, I make a motion we approve the special use permit for the addition, subject to staff comments, with the additional requirement of the type C buffer along southwest and north property lines. That's my motion.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on that motion? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that portion of the application has been granted. We'll move on now to the portion dealing with the extension of time for the use of two portable classroom buildings on the property.
And this would be, the way it's worded, to be the sooner of the CO, or 18 months. which 18 months would be a sunset provision on these portables, regardless of whether they decide to build or not, or whatever they're going to do.
Exactly. The purpose is to not have these temporary structures there on a permanent or an indefinite basis. The purpose is to allow them within reason to keep them while they're doing this expansion, and then for them to be going off the property. Or if they don't start the expansion, 18 months is the maximum that staff recommends that you allow them to be there.
I guess 18 months would cover, any sort of, I don't know if we've imposed some additional cost upon them for the buffer. They might delay this or whatever, but I would think, based on the history, that 18 months seems to me to be pretty generous to them to get whatever done they need to get done, get those portables done. So I would move for approval of the extension of the portables for the language staff recommended, which is until the CO on the new building, or 18 months, whichever comes first.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second on that portion. Any further discussion on that? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that portion of the application is granted as well. Mr. Steele, appreciate y'all coming. Ms. Kennedy, we appreciate y'all coming in today.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your participation. Okay, looks like we're now on to staff reports and other business.
Just two items, Chairman Rogers, both of which will be really quick. The first of which is that, as you all know, you have 9 more days to get your 4 hours in if you haven't done so already, 4 hours of continuing education. And I know that some of y'all either have out or plan to check out some of our wonderfully entertaining planning videos from our planning library in the planning department.
Always checked out when we go.
They're always overdue. I think
They require dusting off your VCR too. No DVDs.
We're trying to change that. We're trying to upgrade our technology. I'll let you borrow my VCR if you want to. It's kind of a generic one, but
Got free with your escort, didn't you?
I think the escort wasn't seen this month. Full
Did they even
disappointed.
have VCRs when that escort was made?
we were on Betamax then, I think.
8-track.
Our other item is something that I mentioned to y'all at lunch today, but I wanted to make sure that the viewing public knows this, that our meetings are now being web streamed live on the city's website, thanks to our award-winning Channel 3 department. I always like to give them a plug when we can. But our meetings, just as people are seeing them now, also can be seen on Channel 3, and then people can also access archived BZA meetings, Planning Commission meetings, City Council meetings on Channel 3 or on the city's website as well. So anytime someone misses it and wants to see a BZA meeting, they can hop online. Other than that, all I've got is happy holidays.
Same to you.
Same to you.
To you. All right, any other business then? If not, then we are adjourned.